thank you so much for giving me this space to tell you about my research. I'm going to talk today about a very particular project on parenting for a digital future, which is part of the network funded by the MacArthur Foundation in the US, which is called the Connected Learning Research Network. And the purpose of the larger exploration has been to understand whether and how digital technologies can improve the connections among the people around the youth, around children, and increase, therefore, the opportunities for their learning. And the concept at stake has been the idea of connected learning, connecting learning. And as this network began its research and looked at the wider frame, one thing that I felt very strongly is that the role of parents in supporting or perhaps undermining their children's connection and learning opportunities is often neglected. So it's very odd that how much the literature talks about, especially in relation to learning, it talks about children, it talks about teachers, it might talk about educational policy, but the sense was that the parent the child arrived at an informal learning class or arrived at school as if from nowhere and disappeared at the end of the learning session as if to nowhere. And I became very interested in the role of the home and the parents, particularly in supporting learning. So that's how it began, and I'm, of course, well aware that there's a very strong tradition in this group of studying parental mediation, but the parental mediation tradition is not so well connected to the learning tradition. It is more about managing safety and behaviour within the home. So I really wanted to bring the two together. And some of you will know that I have an interest in media literacy, and media literacy at the moment is, of course, bringing together those questions of learning and being a critical citizen in relation to media, bringing that together with questions of risks and opportunities. So anyway, this is one intervention to try to think about the role of parents. And the work in this project I've done with my colleague Alicia Blum-Ross. We work together at LSE, and we've just finished our book manuscript, which has just got its reader's report, so it will come out soon, and it will be called Parenting for a Digital Future. So I'm going to give you a sense of the arguments of the book in the next half hour, and I'm going to start in the middle, because the middle is a good place to start. And maybe, no, I'm not. In a minute.
It's just the hour of late.
Yeah, I thought so. Oh yeah, good. All right. So, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mimi Ito's work, but she's very intrigued by the idea that geeks or geekiness is kind of the leading edge of understanding how people might engage with digital technologies. And we have a chapter in the book which is about the geeky families who we found as part of our research, and try to raise some questions about what they can tell us. Can we learn from the geeks for the rest? So Danny is the single parent mother, actually, of Josh, who is 12. And I sat down with them for a cup of tea, and they began somewhere in the middle to have a really intense conversation with each other about Ashley Madison. Who knows why? Does everyone know the Ashley Madison scandal? When it's a dating app for people who are married, and all the data was hacked and leaked. And Danny, who has been kind of going to night school to learn, quote, ethical hacking, had become very interested in the questions of privacy and trust. Anyway, she kind of began her story, and Josh joined in, and in the process they both talked about themselves as geeks, and they were proud to be geeks. So when I heard Danny's story, Danny gave me, as it were, a theory of learning in the digital age, and therefore also a theory of parenting. So her theory of learning is to say, just as in the old days you wanted your child to learn Latin, now today you want your child to learn Java, or coding. And that's the role of the parent, and it's also the skill for the future, because Danny is excited about the digital future. This is her words. She just poured it out. And she has, as it were, the social scientist theory of societal change. Work is becoming more fluid, everything is transforming, and the responsibility of the parent is transforming within this. It will become, as it were, embarrassing. What, you don't know Java? Like, you know, get with it. And this is her responsibility. So forgive this long screen, which is of course too detailed, but I know people are listening from many languages, so I thought in a way words on a screen were sometimes helpful. But also this is one detailed conversation between Danny and Josh that I wanted to show you. Because in the theory of informal learning, this seemed to me a really great example of scaffolding. This is how Danny, through a conversation about how did Josh get into becoming a geek? How did he become a geek? Why was he into coding? And they played it out for me. And Danny says, well, you just got into computers, didn't you, in a kind of informal way? And Josh says, well, actually, I began with gaming, as many boys do. And Danny says, well, I came from that course where she'd been learning ethical hacking, and in the process said, why don't you, my son, have a go at this in a kind of casual way, but not so casual. And we had a little play, and Josh says, oh yes, that's right. And Danny then explains, as it were, the work that she did quietly as a parent to make it possible for Josh casually to learn coding. She had to install on her computer and get it in playing, and then the first computer wasn't right, so she had to have another computer. You begin to see the resources that she can call on as a parent. And Josh agrees, and they kept playing. And then Danny, as it were, gives Josh the theory. You're creating something at the same time, right? And Josh says yes. And then she gives the message, the explicit message. You do realise, don't you, that's what happens when people make a game. This is how you move from being the game player to the game creator. And she's kind of scaffolded his understanding, his reflexive awareness of what he's doing as a potential creator, as a potential actor in the world, not just yet another boy playing computer games. But to do so, she's drawn on a lot of resources. Her training, her possession of multiple computers, her understanding of the world of coding, and her commitment to that exciting digital future by which she is kind of step-by-step encouraging Josh to enter. And this seemed to me a very kind of significant set of ways in which a parent could act. Not all parents in my fieldwork do, but some take this very careful role. And so Josh has begun to embody this role. So he says, you know, I'm aware that lots of kids in my class have heard of Java, and they kind of know what it is, but they don't know what it is. They're in that kind of ambivalent state. Well, actually, he says, no, they don't know. They know, and you know, his ambivalence is evident, his uncertainty, but he's kind of making his steps. And then a little later in the interview, he says, you know, those other kids, they're so cool. They play football. They have all these friends. And what emerges is that Josh is the classic geek. He doesn't play football. He doesn't have all those friends. He's the boy at home staring at the gaming machine. But he's been given a positive narrative, and it might be right. You know, we don't know. So he is your kind of typical geek on the outside of the social scene, but now he has a new pathway, and his mother is very committed to this pathway. And in a way, our project is about the uncertainty. You know, how do we advise Danny and Josh? Is she right that Java will be the answer for her son? Is it right just for the child who's a bit on the outside and doesn't play football and know how to make friends, or is it the way for everybody, as Danny believes? Should we be encouraging everyone to code, as many of our governments are? And should we be, that horrible word, responsibilising or parents to take on this scaffolding and learning role that some parents are, and that Danny believes. Danny believes that geeks will inherit the earth. She says it, and she speaks the rhetoric of the world of geeks. So that's kind of one analysis in the middle of our book, and our book has really tried to kind of step back and say, beyond the rhetoric of digital natives and digital immigrants, what are the ways in which parents of children are finding connections and possible ways of together managing life in the digital age? And we have many different kinds of families telling many different kinds of stories, and we try to think about the expectations families have, the nature of family life. We go through a kind of day in the life. We have a very, I think, important analysis of social inequality that I'll say something about. We have a focus on disabled children, or children living with special needs and disabilities, because they often have particular hopes for the digital world and what technology can offer. And their parents are often very motivated and invested in the possibilities of a digital future to compensate for or provide a workaround for the limitations and failures of society to meet the needs of their children. We look at parents' own digital learning. What are parents themselves learning? They're not the digital immigrants, but what do they know? How are they learning? And we think about how they're imagining the future. And we end with research methods, which I'll say a little about in a minute. So our questions really are, how are parents bringing up their children in the digital age? What's expected of parents? What is that role? What are the hopes and fears that parents have for the future, and why have those become attached to the digital technologies? And in a way, our core argument is that all kinds of things about changing societies have somehow become rhetorically identified with questions of the digital in such a way that parents think to engage with the digital might be a way to solve the challenges of social change and the future more broadly. And it must be said that parents are not handed many other ways or discourses by which to engage with social change, but they are constantly enjoined to act in relation to technology. They are constantly invited to take a position in relation to technology and to theorise, as it were, to reflect on their parenting in relation to technology in ways that they are not in other domains. And then how does it relate to other socialising agents? Back to my original inquiry, how does parenting relate to what happens in the school or in informal learning environments or in relation to friends and community? And there the argument is, in essence, that parenting is somehow made invisible by the school. And it's a political argument that schools, to control their domain and to kind of manage their own sphere of expertise, keep parents at bay, even though they say they try to invite them in, but under very controlled circumstances. But parents themselves feel, and this may be different in different contexts, ours is the story of Britain and particularly of London, but parents themselves constantly feel that the door of the school is closed in their face, and what happens inside the school is unknown to them. And this is a problem because as we saw with Danny, their effort is really to try to build those better connections for their child. So Alicia and I spent a few years working with the most diverse set of families that we could find. We kind of began by trying to find more geeky, more digitally oriented families, and then we spread out and we really looked for diversity trying to make sure that we had rich and poor families, that we had able-bodied and disabled, or families, that we had all kinds of difference. And we did a mixture of interviews, ethnographic observation, and in fact a survey. And I'll just show you one of the survey findings to start, because I think it illustrates some of the challenges that we face also in our field in studying how families engage with technology. So this is a simple question. Thinking of the past week, have you and your child done any of these things together? And I want this slide just to show, despite all the negative talk about the dissolution of family life, everyone is staring at the screen, right, and no one talks to each other anymore. Actually, families are, number one, still eating together, and number two, engaging with traditional media together. And this is still the heart of family life. And some of the more geeky digital activities, like interacting on social media or creating things through technology, these are still near the bottom. This is Britain, so religion is absolutely at the bottom, but who knows what the pattern would be in other cultures. But a meta point is all of these activities, they may or may not be digital. Actually, we don't know. Perhaps shopping is done on eBay or on Amazon. Perhaps talking about things important to you is done through WhatsApp. Perhaps playing games together is playing computer games. Actually, we don't know. And we have a kind of a crisis of measurement, but also an interesting challenge, because family life has become digital in many ways that we need to understand. But it's become digital in all the ways of all the things that families do. It doesn't replace all the things families do. They do the things they always did, but sometimes they do them digitally in ways that escape our analysis. I've put up the mother and father gender differences there, but actually they're very small. They're mainly in relation to computer games and not so strong. But around these activities, this, as it were, normal family life, there is some very polarized discourses. And the discourses are so opposed that it gives families, parents, a lot of trouble. So again, this might be culturally variable and you would reflect in different ways, but British families are told very clearly two things. Digital is the future, it will be where the jobs are, you must get your children into the digital world, and screen time is bad, it will rot your child's brain, you must not let your child near a computer. Parents are a bit confused and conflicted. This is not, and this is all, strong official advice, but coming, some from the Ministry of Business and some from the Ministry of Family and the Ministry of Education. Flip-flops, doesn't quite know. So what our survey tells us is that parents are doing both. They're trying to please these conflicting injunctions. So on the top right, half of parents say when it comes to technologies, I like to be ahead. I'm trying to be ahead. I want us to think about the effort parents are making to try to be ahead in a digital world and what support, what advice they get for that process. And at the same time, around on the bottom left, around half of parents say, I'm trying to resist and limit my family's use of digital media. And these are not different people. There is, as it were, a 2 by 2 of parents taking different positions in this struggle. What I want to draw your attention to is the role of the parent that these different discourses imply. So, all the jobs, in 2030, today's children will be adults, right? They'll be on the job market. And they'll be doing jobs that haven't yet been invented. And the role that parents are given in relation to this discourse is broadly that of kind of cheerleader. Like, go for it, learn coding, get a computer, rah, rah, we celebrate. And in relation to the problem of screen time and the need to limit, the role of the parent is essentially that of the police. And I'm very struck by how much the injunctions to parents to control, to ban, to spy on their children, to monitor and limit and punish and restrict, it's the kind of and people will say explicitly, you should police your children's screen time, but you should also be cheerleader to your children's role in the digital future. So the role of the parent in the family is very conflicted. At the same time, as the broader trend in family life, as Tony Giddens and Ulrich Beck and many have told us, is broadly towards a democratizing of family relations. A move towards trying to create a more egalitarian conversation between parent and child, in which the parents are neither the police nor the cheerleader, but they are doing what Danny does, or they should do. The invitation, the trend is towards what Danny does, which is to scaffold and mentor and kind of broker the child's gradual induction into the larger world in ways that positions the child as an agent and a reflexive agent of their own unfolding future. So underneath that kind of conflicted policy debate that positions parents in this impossible way, actually, the survey also shows us that parents are quietly changing their practices. So despite being told to be either cheerleader or police, actually we found 5 in 6 parents who use the internet, which is nearly everybody, are using it in similar ways to Danny, to more or less degrees. They're using it to support their child's learning. They too go to YouTube to find something to help their child's understanding. They're learning themselves through digital means. They're looking for educational resources. They are engaging with the digital world in similar ways to Danny. And the question then, I think, for policymakers is, what do they find? And do they find the resources that help them? Do they find the resources that empower them? Do they do so in ways that are equal or unequal? How does it help them? So back to some families. So Natasha and Jasper were a similar case to Danny and Josh, but they were also very significantly different. So they're actually, Natasha is a bit wealthier, and she's also a single parent, because she's been recently widowed. And though she's smiling in this picture, we had a rather sad interview, both because she was recently widowed and because she was left with a 12-year-old son who she didn't understand, because he is obsessed by computer gaming. And was delighted. The minute I walked in the door, he said, "Come and see my new..." he had one of those gaming machines with the red keyboard and the special chair and the very fast screen and mouse. He was very excited, took me up and wanted to show me. And Natasha sat downstairs and said to me a bit mournfully, "What is he doing up there? I don't understand what he's doing. Can you tell me?" And I thought, you could go up, stairs, you can ask him. But there's the emotional barrier for her, this kind of symbolic barrier. That's his space and I don't understand it and I'm on the outside, was too much for her to do what I just did, to go upstairs and say, "Hey Jasper, show me your computer, what are you doing?" So there was a real kind of break and a sadness in very similar positions. And Natasha was full of all the, despite being an educated, relatively wealthy woman, was full of all those stories the newspapers had given her. It's rotting his brain, he's spending too long, he's becoming addicted, he'll fail in school, it's not taking, he thinks he'll become a coder, but it's going nowhere. And she couldn't, even though she was well-resourced, she did not have the resources to escape this. So what we had from lots of the families was with their different discourses, their different ways of talking, their different theories, if you like, of parenting and the digital future. Lots of different ways in which the technology had become the language through which they navigated the change in society and the change for their family. So this is Daisy, Daisy and Jacob, and Daisy says, you know, it's changing fast. The iPad is going to be embedded everywhere in our windscreens of our cars, our window panes. Plenty of families were aware of how soon it will be embedded in our retina or, you know, in our arms, wherever they see the kind of the coming of the cyborg, the coming of the smart home. And Daisy does what Alicia and I came to call a kind of balancing strategy. So if Natasha resists the digital future and Danny embraces the digital future, most families were somewhere in between, like Daisy and Jacob, and they tried to balance between embracing and resisting. And balancing, I thought at first, is something fairly simple. You know, the Danny's effort I could see to embrace, Natasha's resistance I could see, but balancing in the middle is also an effort. And families spend a lot of time observing that balance and making sure they've got it right. We do some encouraging, we have the technology, we do some resisting, but also we find our way of balancing. And in fact, what Daisy and Jacob did, they were very arty creative. They had very little money. In British terms, they were on the lowest income, but they both had degrees in the arts. And I walked into their little flat and I kind of banged my head on papier-mâché craft projects, and I tripped up over the painting and the crayons on the floor. And they took their arty aesthetic into how they tried to balance the digital. So they would curate particular computer games that had an aesthetic that they approved of, and they would then engage with their children in playing with these, and they would balance that with playing outside and doing, as it were, physical craft work. So balancing was for them actually an incredibly demanding strategy, but it was one that fitted with their values and what they tried to do in their lives. And the digital became a means of expressing their values to their children and a way of navigating a path for their children. So they were also scaffolding and mentoring, but in a different direction from Danny. So I'm not going to tell you about 73 families, but I'll just give you four more in quicker sketch, just to give you a sense of the variety. And when I began the project, the variety of families was almost the main point, because the discourse of parenting is so homogenizing and it becomes so seemingly dominant that one have to remind yourself that families are different in significant ways. But as soon as you begin field work, as many here know, as soon as you start knocking on the door and say, "Hi, can I come in and talk to you about technology," which families are generally happy to do, and they give you a cup of tea and they start pouring out their worries or their hopes. As soon as you start talking to them, you're introduced to the variety and the diversity. So Kyle, who was 13 and, as you can see, has moderate to severe autism. Kyle was almost non-verbal, so at the severe end of the autism spectrum. And a year or so ago, he suddenly discovered online a kind of an architecture app, a design and planning app that was actually meant for adults, but he got into it and fastened onto it, and it became his passion. And it more or less gave his father a role. His father could suddenly say, "Okay, my role now is to support this passion, because thank goodness my child has a passion and feels that he's gaining a skill, and maybe he is gaining a skill and maybe it will provide a pathway, I don't know. So the family had kind of rearranged themselves around this digital passion, so now they take their digital camera when they go for a walk in the town and they photograph buildings or planning arrangements or where the paths and roads are, and Kyle embeds that into his digital activities. It was a moot point how sophisticated and how much he really understood, but for the family, this was the dominant narrative and this was the dominant activity, and it gave them a path, because most of the families we interviewed with children with special educational needs really struggled to talk about the future at all. And often when we said, okay, we see how you engage with technology now, where do you think this is leading and what do you think it will offer your child? And quite a lot of parents were emotionally struggling at this point in the interview. It was very moving because they really don't see a future at all. And I really wanted to I think of them especially when I see government saying, oh, you should restrict screen time to 1 hour. And I think, excuse me, can we think about what is happening in some of these families where the screen might be the only point of connection between the child and the parent and a source of hope for the family? Wembe is a very different case. We had to go from house to house and we've been in a different world. Wembe is a Congolese asylum seeker in Britain. And when he left his country, he left behind a pregnant wife. At some point the children came over, but his first 5 years of connection with his daughter, who was then born, and with his wife were by WhatsApp and Viber. And that was the relationship. And then about just before we did the interview, the 5-year-old daughter had come and was getting settled into a British school. And they picked up their relationship that had been formed via digital networks and built the relationship, and now, of course, the mother is still back home, so the family is still connected only by digital technology. But it has created their connection, and again, to say 1 hour a day, what is that? This is their relationship. And then they illustrated the other problems. So imagine Wembe, he's a filmmaker back home, he's trying to be a filmmaker in London. The school where his 5-year-old daughter now goes celebrates, as we do in every year in Britain, we celebrate Black History Month. The daughter is learning this. I say to the father, did you show any of your films in the school? Perfect opportunity. Could you go in and discuss your... No, door is closed. School does not know that they have a black filmmaker able to talk about, celebrate Black history and tell a story. They don't know, they don't hear. He doesn't know how to overcome that barrier. And so he sits at home and he worries how his daughter is fitting in, even though she is now with him. And digital is so important to them in ways that are nothing to do with being a cheerleader, nothing to do with being the police, really about the values of the family and the hopes of the family to be together and to find a viable way for them to advance in their lives. So, I'll just say a little about class and then I'm going to come to some conclusions. Felix, you're going to wave at me when you think everyone's had enough.
No, it goes perfect in time.
So we had some, as you've seen, we had some wealthy people and we had some poor people. And I just introduced to you here, Lila was one of the poorest. She was also a migrant into Britain. She had very little money, very little education, and poor grasp of English. And Michelle and Josephine, who are actually also migrants, but were super wealthy migrants from Europe, she from France, who lived in, and the contrast between their houses could not have been more different. Lila lived in real poverty and was struggling with ill health. And Josephine and Michelle lived in a gated community in an enormous marble apartment where I barely dared to sit down because I might break something of enormous value. You know, there's the moment when you just try to settle yourself and relax in a family home. I felt completely, it was amazing. Not that I was envious, it was also quite horrifying, but the whole apartment was wired with a complex digital system of supporting but also monitoring the children. And what Lila had was, and we saw this in a number of homes, she had the kind of classic broken computer that was trying to work and didn't work and flashed an error message throughout the interview in a way that she could not fix, though she knew her daughter would when she got back from school. Anyway, what's interesting is that they both speak, as you can see in the quotes, they both speak the same kind of rhetoric. They both want their children to be agents and believe that education is the future and that digital education is particularly important. So Lila, you can see, is happy with the computer even though she can't afford it because it's the way ahead. And Michelle and Josephine, who were aware of a more complex world of sensors and artificial intelligence, but nonetheless they both were putting their children into coding club. Though in Lila's case, it was the free coding club in the school after school. And in Josephine and Michelle's case, it was a very expensive summer camp. It's a really interesting question. You know, I want to come back to all these families in 10 years and see how it turned out. And maybe Lila's children learned something of value as much as the others, and maybe not. But I'm very struck by how they all have the same discourse. And here is Lila again, you see. She's got the American Academy of Pediatrics rules in the middle quote. She doesn't know it's the American Academy of Pediatrics, but she knows that the scientists have told her 1 hour and turn it off. And that's a puzzle to her because the computer is the thing she's struggling so hard to pay for to give her children a chance. So everything I've said is classed. All the digital opportunities are classed. And I've kind of tried to point to the way in which families have very different kinds of resources and expertise to draw upon. And we can see the ways in which cultural capital builds connections. I haven't said so much about the wealthy, but Josephine and Michelle, for example, not only sent their child to the expensive coding camp, but Josephine also sat on the board of managing the expensive coding camp and made very sure that the children's school knew just what skills her children had and made sure that they were optimised in the school environment, unlike Lila or Wembley or some of the others. And looking back over the geekier children, by and large, the geeky children that we interviewed came from the wealthier families, though not 100%. And yet, you know, there are some commonalities too. So we can see the importance of concerted cultivation, as Annette Leroux would put it, in ensuring that middle-class advantage further reproduces itself. But we can also see that across the board, that discourse of the digital future versus screen time results in a kind of pressurizing of parents and a responsibilizing of parents in ways that becomes burdensome, but also curiously empowering. Because while it was hard for poor families before to know how to help their children's education, in a way now they feel they have a recipe. They can buy the computer, they can check their child joins the coding club, they can kind of show an interest in their computing. They feel that perhaps now there's something that they can do to help their child's learning, but there wasn't 20 years ago when they didn't feel welcome in the library and they didn't feel welcome in the school. But what it offers them is all uncertain. So to end, the question that I get up with very often in the morning is, am I studying family life and parents, children, 'twas ever thus? What can we really say? This is also my question for you. What can we really say about what difference it makes that parents are now bringing up their children in a digital world with a supposed digital future, and what do we mean by that, digital? And I think I have 3 answers. You may add more. But first is nearly all the parents that we interviewed gave us this story. When I was young, I went out to play in the ground outside and I talked to people face to face, and there wasn't any of these screens in the way. And now the digital marks the change. It marks the change in the society, it marks the change in my responsibilities as a parent, it marks the new kinds of uncertainties, and it means that we're all talking about digital technology, and parents are all talking, is it okay to share, how many hours is okay, you know, is this game good or bad, instead of talking about some of the other challenges that parents are facing. So when do we talk about poverty or inequality? When do we talk about family breakup or the struggles of single parents? Why don't we talk more about disability? Now, I've tried to kind of say these other differences and struggles are shaping families' lives, but they don't get the headlines like how much screen time is too much. So it marks the change, but it also distracts us perhaps from some of what's important. It also, the digital preoccupies contemporary parenting culture in a way that I've tried to illustrate that everyone speaks that discourse, but it does offer some new identities and some new pathways. So Danny and Josh are finding a new identity as a geek. I don't know what they would have done 20 years ago. Maybe they'd have been a different kind of a geek. They might have collected stamps or spotted trains or whatever, but that didn't offer a path to a job. And the geeky thing offers a way to a future that has a narrative that they can embrace, as it were, a bit on the margins of the mainstream. And similarly, what would Lila have done 20 years ago before the digital? She still would have tried her best with her children's education, but what would she have done at home? What could she have provided? She couldn't really provide books because her English wasn't so great, but now she feels she can offer them a digital future, and society tells her she's doing the right thing. So let's hope she is. But at the same time, the digital twists the knife in the wound, as it were. It compounds all those anxieties and tensions that parents feel. So they've always probably felt the world is changing and they don't quite understand. But the digital world is more complex and faster changing and more rapidly in the hands of children than it is in the hands of parents. And so it seems more anxiety-provoking and more uncertain. And parents, Actually, I've done a number of projects where parents are very keen to talk to me, but perhaps never so much as here, where parents just, the minute I'd walk in the door, they say, can you come and, as it were, give us a health check, like, are we doing it right? Look at what we're doing, give us advice. And Alicia and I had a number of kind of ethical arguments about, you know, how we would go with the flow of the interview and not say so much until the end, but then we would have a moment of answering whatever questions parents had at the end, and their questions were also interesting. So the vulnerabilities and the tensions that the parents feel are also very notable. Okay, so I gave everyone a flyer with my blog, because we're trying to blog the work as we go in anticipation of the book. There are more things that the book will have space to say because it's too long and I need to find a way to cut, but then it will come out. The blog, if you haven't seen it, is parenting.digital, and everyone here is very welcome to write and say they'd like to write a blog post or talk about their research, and a number of people here have. So it's also, I hope, a space for this community to share the research for others. And with that, I will thank you very much for your attention.